Last weekend was the Moab 240 mile, my goal race for the season. And what a race it was. This is episode 15 of my 2023 training diaries. And as promised, I'm going to tell you all about the race. And I'm sure it'll be no surprise for anyone who follows me on Instagram or Facebook or Strava, because I've been just over the moon about my second place finish, just 5.5 minutes behind first place finisher Jesse Haynes. Definitely the best result of my running career so far. I hired my friend Derek Lytle, one of the best in the trail running filmmaking business, to help me with this one. And between us and Audrey and my pacers, we filmed just a ton of footage, more than 10 hours worth. So I'm sure that it's going to make for my best film yet as well. But I'm not going to give away too much in this video because while you know the result, the way that those final miles played out is a story that I want to tell properly. So instead I'll focus more on some of the logistics of the race, like my sleeping strategy. And I'll let you know how my heat training and my gear and my nutrition worked out that I talked about in the last episode. Now, since the race, I've been taking it really easy. I finished early on the Monday, so we hung out around the finish line until the cutoff and awards on Wednesday morning. And then we camped and relaxed around Moab for another couple of days after that, before driving back to Denver to catch a flight home here to Vancouver on Saturday. So let's talk about the big four when it comes to planning any 200 miler, which are pacing your race, sleeping, nutrition, and when it comes to American 200s, the use of pacers. My A goal for Moab was originally about 72 hours, which I figured would be good for a top 5 finish. I then had a B goal of sub 80 hours, but really anything over 80 hours I would have been disappointed with, just given my experience with races of these distances. I wasn't there just to finish or to be fighting cutoffs. It was really about how fast I could run. I put together a spreadsheet with buffer times for each aid station where the buffer grows in size as the race goes on. And I'll try to find time to do a separate video about this sometime for my supporting channel members because I think it's a really useful exercise, even for 100 milers. But I basically ended up coming in to each aid station at my fastest predicted time. And you can see here that Audrey was keeping notes and keeping track as we went. Now, the next thing I had to think about was a sleeping plan. And I think this is one of the most overlooked but important steps in a 200-mile race strategy. And I find that a lot of runners don't really have a sleep plan, which is different than planning not to sleep. That's fine if that's something that you think you can pull off. But I definitely recommend at least considering where you might want to sleep if you do need to, and which stops you might want to avoid. For example, at Tor, there are some sleep stations that are really cold. And there's others that are just really humid, and a few that are way too crowded and way too noisy to get any sleep at all. And there, they didn't allow you to sleep on the trail for safety reasons. So experienced runners, those who run Tor more than once, typically end up taking their naps at very specific sleep stations, and not other ones if they can avoid it. Now, in my case at Moab, I wanted to take full advantage of our Baja truck camper from Ross Monster. It would be warm, comfortable, I'd have my sleep mask and my noise-canceling headphones, and above all, I would have Audrey there to wake me up at a certain time, which would make me much more comfortable closing my eyes in the first place. I find this to be the most stressful part about closing your eyes during a race, the fear that you might not wake up again when planned. Now, Moab did have sleep stations, although I'm not actually sure how warm they would have been. I think many runners ended up packing sleeping bags and things like that in their drop bags, which for me would have been just a whole other consideration. One that fortunately I didn't even have to think about. I didn't have any drop bags for this race at all. We just kept everything in the truck. Now, they did, though, allow for dirt naps, and I know that a lot of runners did end up having to sleep on the trail. But I always try to avoid this when I can because your body cools down really quickly. In fact, I think that's the reason that most people end up only napping for about 10 minutes when they're sleeping on the trail, because they just wake up after 5 to 10 minutes when they start shivering, which doesn't take very long. Another challenge, though, at Moab is that crew aren't actually allowed at every aid station, and the ones that they can visit aren't very evenly spread out. There are gaps up to 50 miles between a few of them, with 3 in a row only about 12 to 15 miles apart. Now, my plan was to sleep 2 to 3 times, with the first time being around 32 hours or so into the race at either Shea Mountain or Monticello Lake, which are 2 of the crew-accessible aid stations that are only 12 miles apart. I ended up getting into Shea a little ahead of schedule, so I skipped that one. But by the time that I reached Monticello, I was ready for a reset. Now, I'd originally planned these naps for just up to 60 minutes, but then I decided to allow myself up to 90. But if I woke up sooner, then I'd get up right away. I wouldn't try to fall back asleep. And in the end, I woke up after 45 minutes during that first nap, and I headed straight out the door. I then slept again at the next aid station, Dry Valley, for another 45 minutes, so twice on that second night. But then I was good to go until Geyser Pass on the third night, where I slept for 60 minutes, my third and final nap. So in total, I slept for 2.5 hours over the 3 nights. Now, a nutrition strategy is arguably the most important thing for a race like this. You just can't run for 3 days or more without a steady and a real intake of calories. And my plan was really just about eating as much as I could stomach when it came to real food at the aid stations, as well as on the run. This meant leaving every crew-accessible aid station with 2 full bottles of NAC energy drink mix in my front flasks, worth 250 calories each. And I'd probably drink about 1 of these every 2 hours, along with water from my 1.5 liter bladder. I'd always leave with at least 2 NAC waffles, 2 purees, and a NAC energy bar. And for those longer stretches between crew-accessible aid stations of up to 50 miles, I'd carry an extra puree and maybe an extra energy bar, along with 2 extra portions of NAC drink mix powder in little baggies so that I could refill my flasks along the way. So quite a few calories from easily digestible run nutrition. And NAC products are primarily carbohydrates, but they also have protein and amino acids, which is really important for multi-day events. I'd then eat something solid at basically every aid station. And this started out as smaller portions of things like grilled cheese sandwiches and quesadillas, but progressed to burgers and breakfast wraps, as well as sushi and pasta from Audrey at the crew-accessible aid stations. So I was probably coming close to meeting my regular daily caloric needs of about 2,500 calories from this kind of solid food alone, along with probably a good 250 calories per hour of run food. Now on top of this, I was stacking exogenous ketones from Ketone IQ. I would take a shot basically every 4 hours when I saw Audrey, and again would carry an extra shot for those longer stretches without crew. So I ended up taking about 18 doses throughout the race, and those definitely did seem to help. I of course still got really drowsy at night, like I always do, especially on that second and third night. But ketones aren't a stimulant, so they're not expected to keep you awake. But I did feel really focused throughout the entire race on the task at hand. I never wavered in my resolve to finish, and I wasn't distracted by negative thoughts. And I also didn't make any navigational mistakes that I didn't immediately catch. I just felt really engaged in the process the entire time, so I'm gonna call that a win. Now, pacers were the last consideration for me, and something that I didn't actually stress too much about. I've never actually used a pacer before for a 200 miler, since most races in Europe don't allow them. And I definitely don't think it's something that you need to be successful. But why not pass the time with friends if you can? So for this one, I lined up 2 pacers who had offered to help. My buddy Kevin is from Colorado, and you met him 2 episodes ago when we joined him for a run with the Mesa Monument Straters. I actually first met Kevin during Tour des Géants, and we spent what must have been a good 12 hours together then, and we've kept in touch since. So it was great to have him jump in with me for 50 miles or so, starting at the 67-mile mark. Tayson is from southern Utah, and he's someone that I've actually only gotten to know virtually until now, first as collaborators on a few projects through his company Outdoor Vitals, and eventually as friends. But this was the first time that we got to hang out in person. We've got a lot in common though, so we had a ton to talk about and new stories to share, so the time just flew by with him. He took over for Kevin at Shea Mountain and started with a 12-mile stretch before I had that first nap, and then joined me for another 18. Now at that point, the plan was for me to be on my own for the rest of the race. But after the next 50-mile stretch to Road 46, Tayson had gotten some sleep and he felt recovered enough that he offered to jump back in for another 30 miles, up until mile 200, which I gladly accepted. So that just left me with the final 40 miles to do on my own. Now the best decision I made though was having Audrey as my crew chief. She was responsible for keeping everything together, from coordinating and driving my pacers, to managing all of my gear, my food, staying on top of the schedules, and more. There's just no way that I could have executed this race nearly as well without her. This race for me wasn't about trying anything new or seeing if I could finish some new distance. I knew that I would get it done. And instead, I had a very specific time goal to do it in, which, if you're keeping track, I managed to beat by just over an hour. This was about applying everything that I've learned and iterated on from all of my previous races over more than a decade to really try to master the art of these multi-day races. And the most important thing of all in 200-mile races I've found is the need for patience. I made my way from around 15th place early on to 10th place by 100 miles. But it wasn't until later in the race that I finally began working my way up through the top 5 and eventually to 2nd place for the final 70 miles. And I just don't think the pace in these races can be forced. You need to give your body time to settle in and to adapt. You need to eat, drink, sleep, and repeat while putting one foot in front of the other. And if you do, the time takes care of itself. It's a process of discovery. Discovering what your legs and your body are going to allow you to do on the day, how your stomach's going to react, how you're handling the heat, and so on. And once you've reached maybe the halfway points, once you've got 100 miles left, your race can finally begin. This race was definitely Jesse's to lose though. He'd been fighting for first since the beginning, whereas for me, it was simply a possibility that I was discovering along the way. But maybe that's the lesson that I need to take from this race as well, because for all of my planning, there's one contingency, there's one thing that I hadn't planned for. And that's what would happen if I found myself in 2nd place with 1st place in my sights. Maybe I could have dropped the hammer a little bit earlier on, maybe skipped out on some sleep or time at aid stations. But trust me, when you miss out on 1st place by less than a mile after running 240, you really do start to analyze every minute spent not moving. There are lots of places that I could have made up that 5.5 minutes. But it may also just be time for me to start setting more aggressive time goals. I finished the race in 70 hours and 53 minutes, over an hour faster than my fastest predicted time. And I did it on what felt like fresh legs with a smile on my face for that entire final leg. It was by far the most enjoyable race finish that I've ever experienced. So I guess I did something right. We finally arrived back home in Canada, as I said, and with that comes the end of my season, the end of our final adventure in a string of incredible adventures throughout 2023. But I'm not done with the series just yet, because I plan on talking more about my recovery in the coming weeks, and to do a bit more of a deep dive into my training in lead up to the race, because that's something that I didn't talk about in nearly as much detail in this season of my training diaries. So be sure to subscribe to my newsletter if you haven't already. And of course, my work has just begun when it comes to editing my films. My documentary from the Moab 240 is just one of a half dozen projects that I have in the works. But as I said before, I think it's going to be my best film yet.